And we're waiting on YouTube. All right, let me double check YouTube real quick. There we go. I think we are live. All right, I'm going to mute that so we don't get the feedback. All right, welcome everybody. I'm here with MarQuese Liddle. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name's MarQuese. Don't worry about anybody pronouncing it however you like. I've never had anyone pronounce my name correctly here in Wheeling, West Virginia. That's where I'm from. Grew up here. I've been writing for a number of years, though that's not really what I intended to do early in my life. But ended up going back to school after I finished undergrad. Did a degree in creative writing, finished my first novel. It was awful, so I tried again. And now I am not only writing my own stuff, ghostwriting, and doing editing as well, because I really want to live the authorial, is that the right word? Live an author's life and actually try to make it in the field that I want to be in. And I've had a lot of fun since then.
We're making it in the writing world can be tough. So your first book, which I did a review of, I believe, a few weeks ago, I have to say it probably has one of the more interesting names of the books that I've reviewed this year. Tell me, how did you come up with it? Why did you choose that particular name?
So we're talking about Wand Smoke, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So that's actually my second book that I've written. For those of you who don't know, there's another book that I think I unpublished it, but there's still 3 left. The first book I wrote was Salt, Sand, and Blood, but we won't dive into that. But Wand Smoke, I didn't come up with the title until about halfway through the book. Now, if you've read it, you'll know that there are 2 chapters, Wand Smoke Part 1 and Part 2. And it was at that juncture of the book that I felt like I was diving into as much of a kind of weird fantasy pseudo-Western that it was going to be. And I'd already had the name Death Wand. I guess I should tell that story, right, to understand the title. So for those of you who watch a lot of HEMA content, Historical European Martial Arts, you might be familiar with the channel Scala Gladiatoria. Gets run by Matt Easton. And in a video he did on a historical account, he was talking about early revolvers and how people had this impression that they were basically like death wands. You just point, pull the trigger, dead, like never misfiring, that they weren't terribly inaccurate, and the fact that people weren't shooting them out of their offhand, right? And it was like, not even a conical, just like a regular ball, you miss all the time. And that misimpression actually stuck that idea in my head of a death wand. Also, way back in high school, I'd read the Harry Potter series, and this was the 3rd book. On the Muggle televisions, they say that Sirius Black is armed with a gun, because obviously he has a magic wand. But when I heard that, I thought, if he just had a gun, he would be way more effective. Like way, way more effective. You don't have to say Avada Kedavra to kill somebody. And that stuck with me for a long time. So when I finally got to those 2 chapters, the name Wand Smoke, from taking the Death Wand, and then the fact that this was really like a Western-esque feeling story. I like the idea of gun smoke, and so I stuck those together. As for Broken, I was going back and forth with what I was going to call the book, and I felt like the characters are broken people trying to reconstitute themselves as kind of a theme throughout the book. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do. I wanted to do the Wand Smoke title with the series because I thought it was catchier, right? Like it just sounds cool, right? Like Wand Smoke. So I had that as a series title, but I wanted it to be framed in there. So that's why you have the colon and then Broken. So I'm going to have Wand Smoke on all of the titles, because I don't want that thing where you have a series title and for books, but then everyone just goes by the book titles. Like if I say a Game of Thrones, everyone knows what I'm talking about. If I say A Song of Ice and Fire, most people who like that franchise, who would talk about it that way, don't know what the hell I'm talking about. So, that's why I ended up with Wand Smoke Broken, the long story.
Yeah, I think according to Ammo Awesome Art, he does have a point here. If they had a gun, is pretty much the ultimate problem solver in many fictional writings.
Yeah.
I think that should be a genre all in itself, is what if this era had a gun? it would certainly make for an interesting story. Harry Potter, especially, because they have to shout a really loud word to off somebody, whereas a gun just makes the loud noise for them. So,
Yeah, good way of thinking about it.
so you said this book has a Western theme, but I have to say, when I was reading it, I caught more Victorian vibes from it. It felt not quite steampunkish, but like the beginnings of industrialization, like almost like they had colonized this place maybe a century prior, and now they had like a lot of the infrastructure there. That you've got some people with their glass works, and a lot of things seem to be established, but there still seems to be a lot of wild to it. And you said you were into the European martial arts. Do you believe that that might have flavored your writing a bit?
Most certainly, particularly any action sequences. And I studied a traditional Chinese form of martial arts as well. And I was very fortunate about that because it was the rare case where you can study a Chinese martial art where we actually did like hard, full contact sparring without equipment. So like actual sparring instead of whatever BS that you often see. And combine that with the HEMA content and I've done a little bit of practice with friends, nothing formal. But combining that with my prior, much more formal martial arts training, I got a good feel for it. So in terms of the action sequences and how those are framed in the sense of danger, yeah, that definitely influenced the novel. I think you're right to say that it definitely has a more industrial revolution feel. I do have some influences that are directly influenced by Westerns, and specifically in how the you mentioned that it was like wild, or almost it feels like they're on a frontier, kind of like a conquered frontier. Um, that's really the Western-esque bit, I would say, or maybe it's really just like an Americanism that I've superimposed on what would otherwise be a kind of Western European fantasy world. I'm not quite sure, but yeah,
Well,
the Victorian. Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
I was going to say the American expansion westward was a major event in history. There really wasn't much expansion like it in the past, so I could see why you'd want to make the comparison. I
Yeah,
don't think that much land has been colonized with that much of a technological difference ever.
no, I guess not. Right? Yeah, you think about the natives. Yeah, kind of unfair. Uh, but yeah, I do think it's fair to say the setting does feel more. See, when I went to label this thing, it was very difficult because nothing quite fit. Because I can't really call it steampunk. It's not gas lamp. It does kind of have a Victorian sense, but if you called it that and then you read it, you'd kind of be let down because it wouldn't exactly feel right either. So yeah, I've had a difficult time trying to describe the combination of setting, and how would I say,
I would call it musket punk.
musket punk? Yeah,
Musket
that's
punk.
probably that's probably a good name.
It does have a very good feel for like everything feels. There's one scene in particular without trying to ruin anything. They arrive at a city, and the way they get to the city is they have to shut a dam and let the river flood everybody up, and it gives this feeling of all this massive machinery kind of intermingled with the landscape, which feels very Victorian. I think with the massive bulwarks and stuff that they built in Europe, things of that nature. But it had again, yeah, the frontier with the massive industrial stuff coming in, but not quite to the assembly line yet. I like that feel. I like a little bit of wildness to my stories. So speaking of wildness, one of your main characters, Conti, is a troglodyte, and it's implied in the book that troglodytes might have come from humans. Tell us a bit about this race of people.
Yeah, so in this case, if you listen to King Ugir or Jir, however you really are supposed to pronounce his name, a big thing people should know about me is I'll look at a name and read it and not really care how it's pronounced exactly. And so if you pronounce the name differently, that's perfectly fine. But he at one point yells at Conti and basically says, you're like, you idiot, you're just a bunch of degenerate cave dwellers. That's true. So I was inspired by one of Lovecraft's stories, one of his first, it might have been his first story that got published. or maybe it was the second, where the explorer goes down or gets lost in a cave and then encounters someone who'd been like living in this cave for decades, that has become, even though this isn't really how this works, but Lovecraft didn't know any better, become this like creepy albino, like human thing in the cave. Well, I thought, okay, just if there are generations of people and they were living in these caves for centuries and centuries, which is, it's hinted at that the people before the island was conquered, there were humans living on there with the fairies, and the fairies are essentially like they're kind of like almost like predatory gods, right? Like they're you don't want to be under their caprices, and so it would make sense you have someone or an entire group of people just hiding from them as best they could, and then eventually they learned how to enslave the trolls, which would be the ones that would be most likely to chase after them under the ground. So yeah, they're just albinos who are blind from generations of not needing to see and are not parried. They're literally just people. Like I think Broken. I'm okay with spoilers, so you might get spoilers here watching the stream. But yeah, Broken yells at, I think, Domhnall that like, you guys are dumb and blind, and he's just a human. But like, you don't possess the insight to see past your own like preconceived notions, and she was correct. And also, no one listens to her at that time either. There's a theme there, by the way, in the book. When characters say something and then the next thing that happens is like no one really pays attention, you have like a 75% chance that they're correct.
Well, Broken is an interesting character, and just to get into her, tell us a little bit about who Broken is.
All right. So Broken is a little girl in the town of South, and she was born with a terrible skin condition that the people believe is supernatural. It's not. It's essentially an exaggerated form of like psoriasis, but almost like leprosy. And it causes constant crackling, blisters of the skin, often that they bleed, sensitivity even to the sunlight, so she's always in pain. And she's an orphan. How her parents died is rather tragic. I'll try not to spoil it here. And eventually the people of town ran her out once she was old enough that they could bear with the excuse, right? Because like, if a kid is like really tiny, like, maybe you don't run them out. They're just like this creature that lives in the shadows of the houses and is staying alive, maybe on scraps. But eventually, you get out of town, floated down the river, and the river leads to Conti's cave, and then she encounters him. Probably shouldn't say this on the big wide internet, but I will, because it's a really tragic story. So like, Broken she's really funny. She's comedic quite throughout the story, if you're not really, really paying attention to her circumstances. And how I came about creating her as a character. So there's a tragic story from an ex-girlfriend where she happened to have a chronic condition, and her dad had called her damaged goods when she was a kid. And
Ooh.
that had, yeah, right. yeah, right. And that had forever haunted her. And it's really horrible. And that is really what gave birth to Broken, right? Because when you decide to name someone Broken, you've identified like there's something wrong at the core of them, and there very well may be something broken about that person, but also that means that now there is this perception of the self that she has to overcome, and there's this intrinsic tragedy. And because I knew someone who actually suffered basically the same thing, right? Like, here's a disease that has no cure. It has a treatment that might kill you, and like, now deal with that for the rest of your life.
Right.
So, yeah.
So
there's the tragedy.
We got something here that kind of leads into a question. So John Stephenson says, I can sense a lot of symbolism in your work. I'm fascinated by how other people give some deeper perspectives of my own work that I never considered before. How much symbolism plays into your work?
A lot, quite a lot. So I am notoriously, what's the word? Open is not sufficient. I talked way too much about Yoon. So I started reading Yoon years ago. almost drove me insane, which is what happens when you read too much Jung. But what you start to realize is that if you start to pay attention, there you'll find symbols even if you didn't mean to put them there. So I do have a lot of conscious symbolism going in on a first draft, but as I go back and revise, what I end up finding is that uh, most of what I put down has some symbolic meaning. And I actually kind of end up doing a kind of dream analysis on my own fiction quite a lot of the time. And each pass is a discovering of what it was that my imagination was pulling out. You know how we talk, lots of artists talk about this, that where you feel like there's like a muse, or like the writing is coming through you, not from you, right? Like it's coming from somewhere else. You're just sitting there being the conduit or whatever. And I also have that experience, and I find that that speaks in symbols. And if you buy into dream analysis in the Jungian sense, I'm not a big fan of Freud, by the way. I mean, he's all right, but he's also Freud. But yeah, I find that it plays a key role. And actually, the main motivation to my works are really to convey a theme that's the answer to a question that I myself don't have an answer to when I set out to write. And I find the answer to that through the symbolism that I end up discovering after I've written it. So it's very important to me, and I try to let as much of it come into the work as I can.
Well, getting on to a similar but not too distant topic, transmogrification plays a big role in your book. The Fae change, the humans change. Without spoiling too much, I know you're not too worried about spoilers, but I know that people do like to read things and discover things on their own. Um, Tell us a bit about transmogrification in your book and why you chose to put it as part of your world.
Part of it, I think, came from seeing the movie Labyrinth late in life, actually. Um, so I had seen that movie, and with the notorious ex-girlfriend, we were together a long time, so it ends up being while I was writing this book. So that might come up a few times because the life experiences I was having at the time did open me up to what I chose to write. But transmogrification, there's something about the idea that you actually do only have so much time before you turn into one thing or the other, right? And I think we actually do experience this quite a lot in life. And I think this ties into that theme where if you allow yourself to be immersed in, let's say, toxic relationships, noxious friendships, you're in a workplace that you hate, if you're doing things that you hate for a long time, you become bitter and you become resentful, and you start to project all of those feelings out onto other people, and you desire to take revenge on them. And your desire really is to destroy as much as possible. And it's also partly the reason why with there's different kinds of transmogrification. This particular kind of referring to is like the Hobbs, right? Like, so they're essentially little devilish creatures that are the embodiment of the, full corruption and Mephistophelian spirit of the human soul.
Mm-hmm.
But there's other ways that people get corrupted too, right? Like we all know and perhaps some of us have been or may still be the eternal child in the Jungian sense. It's like the failure to launch guy, where you're trapped in adolescence. Well, I won't spoil which one it is. I'm sure if anyone reads, you can figure it out. It's not supposed to be hidden. There's ways to be pulled into being eternally childlike, and you do have certain characters that transmogrify that way and are essentially demasculinized, hyper emotional guys. I kind of base them off of like really hyper vigilant, hypersensitive LA gangsters.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple groups that are like that actually, and they get compared in some of my stories. And then there's even another type of transmogrification with the Fae, where they can be transformed by being taken away from their own nature and essentially made embittered in a sense that they were never meant to. And this is kind of perhaps more speculative because I'm dealing with something that's fundamentally inhuman and trying to think, well, what happens we try to take something inhuman and make it human, or treat something that's inhuman as human, and it becomes this kind of bitter, scratchy, terrible little thing that just causes messes. I think this is, when you think of a resentful house cat, versus, because you've seen that cats, like, they get to live outside and they're happy and they're free, and yeah, they get into fights and they might lose an ear, but like not 9 times, 10 times out of 10, the cat wants to live outside, even if it dies early. And I think that's partly what we're dealing with the Fae and them being transmogrified into terrible little gremlins. So, yeah, that idea of transformation, that you're going to become something, and what you become is represented symbolically by that process.
Well, on this topic, we actually have a question. How much do you take inspiration from the real world into your work? Any real world folklore legends inspiring the creatures in the story?
Yeah, a lot, a ton, way too many. And I'm really not picky about it. And I don't really have any qualms about originality, because I think it's impossible. So I know King Ugir that's the name of like a supposed Danish knight of Charlemagne. And also there's stories about him being represented as the king under the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't read The Hobbit, but like the Dwarf King is essentially that same myth, right? The king, there's this king under the mountain. He becomes corrupted by his obsession with either wealth or power or something else. And that the mountain is, by the way, the mountain is the unconscious, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can go into the symbolism, but I won't. Other inspirations that I take from the real world. Yeah, so I try to take certain amounts of migration, right? So the people who come over and conquer Sealand are essentially Vikings. So you have these Viking people being beset by their own um, enemies, right? Their own cultural and ethnic enemies that they've always been fighting. If you're familiar with, this has kind of happened throughout history, and I'm sure many of the viewers will be very familiar with what is it? Strong men make good times make weak men make bad times. Well,
Kind of the motto for the era.
yeah. Well, for the Vikings, they had heroes and champions, and then they made bad times, and then most of them were weak, and the few strong ones left. And then they came and conquered the weak men of bad times because they were strong men and now made good times. And if you read the book, you'll see there's a lot of um, there's a lot of weak men in the post good times era, because King Ugir was kind of the good times. So yeah, but that process, that cyclical process we see in real history, plus the actual migration of, like, let's say, like the Danes over into something that kind of approximates the British Isles, right? Them coming over and conquering that. I'm sure there's more I could think of, because I do it quite a lot, like names for things. All the creatures, right? So the kobolds are like German kobolds, but it's like all the different legends I could find about kobolds. I gave them the properties of, so they can turn into wind. They hide in mines and caves, but also they are in houses. They can kind of hide in the rocks. Those are all different attributes of different kobold legends. Yeah, a few others I could probably name, but I do try to take from folklore, from history, to the degree that I know it. I'm not a history buff, and I'm not really even a myth, or I should be more of a myth buff, but I'm not. Same thing with folklore, but I do some cursory research and try to put in what I can.
So, speaking of the folklore creatures you have in your story, I noticed there was a bit of an overlap with the Hobbs and what felt like ogres. There seems to be a blending of when things transmogrify, what they become. Was that intentional, or was it just something that felt like it kind of got lost in the creation?
That's intentional, and this is something I don't know why I have this propensity, but I have this resistance to explain things out super explicitly. Um, so I tried with the epithet is epithet, because
Epilogue?
there's epigraph, maybe
Epilogue.
not the end, the little bits that are before
Oh,
each chapter. I think, is it
oh.
epigraph? Is that the right word for
Uh,
that? Somebody knows. Anyway, in those, the reason those exist is actually because I wanted to be able to give some more explicit information on some of these factors. And there's one where it's Nostius's research notes, and I was trying to drop a hint there, but even then I resisted just saying this is what this is. So the Hobbs are a category to which specific types of Hobbs belong. The Fae or fairies are a general category to which particular Fae belong. And is there anything else that I need? Not really. Those are the two major ones, right? So we've got under the fairies, depending on, this is where it gets confusing, right? Depending on the culture, the peoples, you're going to get different names. So from people who are more culturally conquered by the Viking-esque people, the Yggdrasili or Yggdrasilic, depending on who's pronouncing it, they're going to call them sylphs, undines, kobolds, and trolls. And then trolls is a common name that goes across, but the more south you go on the island, like when Broken bumps into Rosalind, and she asks, like, "Are you a brownie?" What does Broken say? What the hell is a brownie? And it's like, "Do you mean a kobold?" And she said, "Is that what you call them, you weird people from the south?" "No, I'm from the north," right? But yeah, so kobolds and brownies are very similar in their folklore. So what I did is essentially say, okay, well, the people from the island called them brownies before they got conquered 300 years ago, and some people still call them brownies, and some people call the undines nixies because that's what they were called naturally on the island. But they're all those are all fairies in the same way goblins and ogres. Like ogres are like mature goblins. Like you're a goblin, you eat enough people, you grow big, and now you're an ogre. You grow hair, get big tusks. If you're a woman and you transmogrify, you become a hag, right? And so those are the generally apparent categories. I have other ones that I haven't used yet, or I have in stories that I haven't published yet that I hope to soon. But essentially, that's the classification. Oh, and the gnolls, which is the little jackal type dog people, like Chaka. Those are also Hobbs. But Conti doesn't know that because the only person who knows to call them gnolls is King Ugir, and he doesn't tell him until chapters end. So he goes around calling them ghouls because I read Lovecraft's work and I like the ghouls. So I put them in my, like I said, I'm not original, so I put them in my my book. So there you go. There's the breakdown of the what would you call that? There's a word for it. Can't remember.
Well, we got a question for you from the crowd. Why did you feel like writing this specific story?
That is a decent question. What sparked it? I know part of it had to do with a perspective change. So before I'd written this, this is going to sound kind of weird, but I had this huge aversion to writing in first person, and I had an aversion to writing in present tense, and I really hated them both together. But I really was disappointed with my first book, Salt, Sand, and Blood, and I thought, okay, so I need to do something differently. I know the characters were not great in Salt, Sand, and Blood, so I thought, okay, I need to challenge myself to do something that I don't want to do because, again, a big union, and when you encounter a problem in your life, probably there's something that you don't want or don't like, and that's exactly where you need to go. So I thought, okay, I'm going to freaking write in the way that I hate the most. And I'm going to use this to focus in on the characters, because when you go to first person, psychic closis, as pretentious as that sounds, it goes up, right? You're right in their head. And when you're in present tense, you're not just in their head, you're in their head immediately. So I think that's what drove me to initiate the story, to start something new and fresh after what I felt like was a failure. Why this particular story? I think because there are a lot of elements that were very close to me. I live like very, very close to the Ohio River. I grew up on literally an island in the Ohio River. It's Wheeling Island. Used to actually be where all the wealthy people lived 100 years ago. It was really nice. Now it's just where all the heroin addicts, well, not all the heroin addicts. There are too many to fit on the island. But a bunch of them live there. Yeah, it's in pretty rough shape now. But yeah, so being on an island close to the river with people around a bunch of people who are drug addicted and coal miners, who are poor, and everyone's ignorant, and everyone's electing corrupt officials because they have like the right name. Like, I don't know if you know, our governor is he's governor because his name is Jim Justice, because his last name is just. I'm not kidding. with people who don't understand their own interests, like not to get into politics, but it's really funny to see like all of the really anti-socialist, like essentially conservative coal miners who are also super like pro-union and pro the government getting involved when they can lever their unions for it. And it's like,
Hmm.
you guys don't. It's just like everything is nonsense. Nothing works. People are poor, making bad choices all the time, um, to the point where it starts to become comedic. And I think I wanted to move away from the grand epic that I had done before. That was probably a bit of me aspiring to be somebody else, and
Hmm.
I wanted to write something that was closer to myself, that I felt like I had a little bit more what my professor in grad school called thick ice before treading out on the thinner stuff as I progressed in the story.
So you said you hated first person perspective. What is your preferred perspective to write a story in?
Now it's first. It used to be third, particularly third limited, probably influenced by George R. R. Martin way too much. Before I went to grad school for creative writing, I hadn't read that much actually, which is probably why my first book was so bad. Right? We see that a lot. But yeah, I liked the storytelling feel of third person, where it has that feeling where you're sitting around a campfire maybe, or you're reading like a big tome to your relatives or something. I liked that feeling quite a lot. But as I started writing in first person, particularly as I started playing around with the voice of the characters, again, another pretentious concept picked up from grad school. I apologize, internet. Uh, but it's a lot of fun, uh, particularly now that you notice that the stories are written kind of episodic, or stories. The book is written episodically. I did that consciously, again, moving away from the grand epic nature of my first book to something smaller, a little bit more piecemeal. And the next work I wrote after that is a series of what I thought were short stories, but actually turned out to be short novellas because
Hmm.
they're so terribly long. Um, they're like the chapters in One Smoke, except some of them are much longer than that. Um, but the fun thing for me, writing a lot in first person, was that I can entirely change the style of prose from story to story to story to story, and uh, you know, reading a lot of different authors from different times and different places. If you pick up, I don't know, go pick up like this isn't fiction, but the Gulag Archipelago, or you can do Dostoevsky as well. The way the Russian authors write, it's just big, gigantic, bombastic, and then you like
Hmm.
jump into Mark Twain. You've got um, the Southern dialect, and it's really thick in the text. And then you can jump into something else, and or like Cormac McCarthy, Blood Meridian. I talk about it all the time because it was a huge influence, and you get this poetic stream of consciousness. I really enjoy being able to play around with the prose that I'm with whatever piece that I'm working on. It's a lot of fun for me.
So we got a kind of question. Are you a good writer?
Um, I I hope that I am. Like if I'm not being modest, I actually think I'm. Uh, I think actually I'm very good at writing stylistically. Like my prose, um, sometimes I go a little bit too purple, but I think
Hmm.
that's necessary. If you want to get better, you have to push yourself right up to your limit, and then you go beyond, and then obviously that's why we edit, to go back and fix things. And you're not always going to be perfect. If I read authors that I really like, they're not always perfect, and I think we well, I don't know if other people do this. I always have to remind myself, the people that I like, if I was writing their books, I wouldn't write them the way that they did, and so I shouldn't feel so bad if everything in my own work isn't perfect. But I do think I'm decent. I think I make errors sometimes when it comes down to continuity with story. I get too wrapped up in the symbolism sometimes, and
Hmm.
I forget details. I don't keep logs and outlines as much as I should. Um, Particularly as the world has been expanding and I've been building on the setting. I'm not really a world builder. Um, I didn't have like the map. I didn't draw the map until after the story was done. And then after the story was done, I added places that I thought, oh, well, more of these places should probably exist. Um, so I think, I wouldn't be surprised to find that I even might have setting holes more than plot holes, but like, little bits and pieces that aren't perfect, particularly if you're very, if you're someone who really enjoys something like world building and the setting being this second existence that you can, escape into. I'm sure I've made errors, but I also think that if you're reading the writing, there will be, I do think there will be plenty of sentences. This is kind of a weird thing to say, but plenty of sentences you read it and like, oh, that was pretty slick. Like, I'm impressed. That's what I hope anyway.
So to get into the technical thing of AuthorTube, you would, I'm assuming you would consider yourself a pantser. You do things as they come up and how they feel, or what would make them feel right to you.
Yes, to my professor's chagrin, um, particularly Jessica Anthony. I could tell she was always really polite, but she doesn't write that way. I don't think she seems to be more analytical with her writing, and she's a very good author. But every time I would say that out loud, like I would look at her face, and she would have this like this pained look of no. But yeah, I have like a almost 100% pantser to, for better or worse.
So we have another question. How do you write descriptions in a way that are descriptive but not too wordy at the same time?
Yeah, I can actually answer this as an editor. So you have to keep in mind a number of concepts. So thick words, particularly thick verbs, are very helpful, but also anything. So any word that has a multitude of meanings within it will help. Another thing that helps a lot is having good mastery over how to make complex sentences. This gets kind of dry, but it's really, really important because I've edited a lot of work. And if you are limited in how you know how to structure a grammatical sentence, that's what produces the wordiness, right? Because most of the time, what you can end up doing is like you've got like maybe a dependent clause and an independent clause, and the way that they're ordered or arranged require extra words to essentially connect them properly. And a lot of times you could flip them around and then like slash off a few words. A lot of those words are like articles or prepositions that don't need to be there, particularly if you then combine that with very rich, colorful verbs and nouns. And the other thing to do is use lots of figurative language. I cannot stress this enough. This is something, again, I learned in grad school, particularly from Jessica Anthony. So thank you, Jessica. I'm sorry I'm a pantser. But what she did teach me is that you really do not want to be discursive if you don't have to be. What do I mean by that? So if you're not familiar with the term discursion, then congratulations, you're not a pretentious prat like I am. It's essentially entirely denotative prose. You're saying things literally. And the problem with that is that when you're writing prose, right? So this is a grammatically structured sentence. You've only got one word at a time, and you can only convey one idea at a time. And if everything has to be literal, it's one detail at a time. What I learned from a little bit of studying poetry is that, and this is true for music if it's well constructed as well, the art there is being able to convey an image as instantaneously as possible, right? So what you're trying to do in poetry is you're trying to evoke an emotion through connotation instead. And you do that through figures of speech and wordplay. Well, you can do the same thing in prose, actually, right? So the example that I remember back from grad school is I could say, the man, stood with his feet shoulders width apart, ordering the door frame with his shoulders back and his head held high, his jaw hanging ajar, something like that. Or I could say the man, the man stood agape in the doorway as if astride a horse.
So you would
Right.
say being succinct or being brief in your description.
I would say that, but the problem with that is that if you don't already know how to do that, that doesn't mean anything. And we encounter this, like if you're a decent writer, like sometimes we think these things. I find this like, I don't know, if we're all writing people, maybe some of us are going to be math people also, but I know I'm not. And I found, why is this relevant? I found when I would be in a math course back in undergrad and I would ask a question, my math professors would freeze and then they would just repeat the same thing over and over and over again, and then do math on the board. But they wouldn't explain what they're doing. And the reason why is because they intuitively were very good at math, but they didn't understand what they were doing. They were procedure monkeys. So like they had the instincts, and that makes sense, right? Because if you're instinctually good at math, you're going to go into math because you're talented at it and it's easy for you. And then like, okay, that makes perfect sense. Not disparaging for that. But one of the problems is if we're talented at a thing, oftentimes we forget, like, okay, so be succinct. What does that mean? Right? So and what that means is try to see when you have opportunities to say something figuratively and using wordplay as opposed to literally. Can you make someone feel a bunch of feelings with an image? And also remember, in literature, imagery is not just visual. Imagery is also all your senses. I really hate that they didn't come up with another word for this. I hate actually a lot of literary terms. I think that whoever came up with them was really lazy, and they just basically copied what other people said before. That's another conversation. And so I don't keep rambling on forever. But yeah, you want to evoke feelings in people. That's the advantage of the written word. Because if you pay attention to other forms of media, like we don't have sound, really. Like you have the sound if the reader reads it out loud, but you can't have like music, right? And if you've ever tried to describe music in your book, you'll find right away it's like you can never do it. You can never really do it justice. So you don't have sound, you don't have visuals that are happening all at once. But what you do have is feeling and interiority of the characters. And you can communicate that through using very rich language so that each word does multiple jobs. And I took that phrasing of essentially the words of the sentences doing multiple jobs from at Eternus over on mine. So go and check his stuff out. Gotta give him credit for that one.
See, I'm both a math person trying to be a literary person because I got my engineering degree, and I'm like, okay, I always wanted to tell stories, so I'm also going to do that too. So I have to spend a lot of time reading what other people did. But just to take a little time from you here, I'll tell you with the procedure monkeys what one of the best things my physics professor ever told me, and it might be just that some people are good at procedure but not good at understanding. He said to learn how to repeat how to do it until you learn why you do it like that. So if you do something enough, you'll begin to understand why you do it like that. But not everybody is very good at describing the why. So we got another question for you here. What genres do you write in? Your favorites, if there's more than one, and why?
So right now I've been writing just a ton of fantasy. I do like blog posts and essays on the side, so I've been planning on doing some nonfiction eventually. I do also, though, want to branch out from fantasy. I want to write a historical fiction novel set here in Wheeling, because there's a lot of cool stuff. Like the city basically used to be run by gangsters. We even have like our own classic like Zoot Suit gangster from like I think the 40s. His name is Big Bill Elias. Yeah, so there's tons of cool history here. And I think a historical fiction novel would be really great. But also, like I mentioned before, I want to write things that are hard. I want to do something with science fiction because I'm intimidated by it, because not as much as I used to be. I had a conversation with Eternus, and which you can see on my podcast, by the way. But actually, can you see it now? I don't think it's released yet. You will be able to see it eventually. But yeah, we talked about science fiction, and I'm less intimidated about it now. Before, I thought I had to do an insane amount of research that I felt like I was unprepared for to take the time. But I think it would be worthwhile doing, particularly in the classic speculative fiction, science fiction story sense, where you're really playing with the consequences of adding a piece of technology into either society or a person's life, and seeing what happens when you change that environmental element. That sounds like a lot of fun. And actually, part of me wants to write like a literary. This is really funny. So I don't know if you've ever gotten this, but when I tell people I write fantasy, who are the very few educated people here in Wheeling, they give me this like pat on the head look, like, oh, good for you. It's like little kid stuff. I kind of want to write a literary novel just so I can have it and hit them with it. And because it's so frustrating, the pretentiousness. So if for no other reason, I want to write something like that academia on the face of it would think they would like, unless they read it, because they would not like my politics. Having been there, I'm dead certain of that. But I want to have something I can hit them with, so they can just like stop trying to pat me on the head. I don't even have hair. I don't know what they're patting. And also, I want to write probably like a romance story again, just
Hmm.
because it's something that I've never really had a deep interest in writing, and I think that would expand me as an author. And that's really what motivates me a lot outside of the stuff that I like. And I'm very drawn to fantasy because of that background in Jungian psychology. Like
Hmm.
it plays with the idea of dreamlike qualities, and symbolism is really easy. It's like really, really easy in fantasy. I think that's what pulls me toward it. But eventually, I want to move away from it.
I'm not looking forward to that head pat. I do have a fantasy series I want to start, but as you know, I haven't done fantasy just yet. Most people look at me weird when they're like, "What do you write?" And I say, "Oh, my big book right now is science fiction sports." And they're like, "I'm not sure how to feel about that." So I
Yeah.
follow them up by telling them. And I also wrote a post-apocalyptic homesteading book, and then they just get really confused. So, speaking of, let's getting back to your book. In your book, you have you have a magic system and a bit of technology in there, but the line between the two seems a little bit blurred. But there is some actual, unquestionable magic going on there. Um, what exactly in your is there actually no line between magic and technology in your world, or is it just misunderstood?
Yeah, so there's the line. I do exaggerate some of the real world things that people can do. So I'll start from the magic end. So the magic, I hesitate to say that there's a system, because the way that I limit what the magic can and can't do is what works symbolically. Like the magic itself is predicated on essentially, again, that idea of a dream analysis. Like these things should happen in accord with the psychological states of the characters, their moral development, and what the symbols mean and how they would come about and how they tie into how these things end up manifesting in mythology. But when people are conjuring lightning, okay, that's magic. When they're resurrecting dead people into terrible monsters, that's magic. Obviously, all the fairies and hobbs are 100% magic. Um, the line between that gets confusing is like the marigold mystics, right? Particularly with Verba. So what I did with Verba is that she doesn't have any magic at all. She's not magical. I
Hmm.
gave her essentially Dune level uh, like theatrics and hypnosis. So her sleight of hand is very, very, like if she was like a D&D character, she's like an extremely high level rogue. So she can pull the what's it called, percussion caps off of a revolver in like a second. Like if she gets
Hmm.
her hand on it, she can essentially hypnotize gullible people. Though she does comment that it doesn't work so well because she's getting older, and when she was like a pretty young girl, it was way easier, um, which I think is probably true.
Hmm.
In terms of a hypnotic effect, at least maybe the viewers will have had that experience. By the way, a small aside, I actually got a chance to ask that in front of class when I taught university. Um, I was teaching a course, and I remember I was doing an example essay that I wrote. I brought up Yoon, and I brought up what he called like the magical power of the female. And I'm glad I got away with this. It might be because the university used to be Catholic, so that helps. But I asked the class, like, does anyone seen this before in their life? And then half of the men raised their hand. And I was happy about. Yeah, that's exactly. It's like, oh yes, when you're just asked to do something that you wouldn't do for someone normally, and you do it. They did. So yeah, Verva essentially, like, she can suggest things with her voice, sort of like the Ben Gesserit, like or Jessica and Dune can, in the same way that like you can do to people in real life, particularly if they believe in it, particularly if you you have a lot of theatrics and stage magic. But when she's using the black flame, she's literally taking primitive gunpowder and being very clever with it. Like, oh, let me rip open the satchel and throw it in the air. So now there's a dust cloud. And also, like, I know a fire breather trick, so I could like swig some alcohol real fast and like take a little striker and the breathe, spark it, catch that on fire, boom, giant. It looks like I'm breathing fire, but it's all stage magic. And probably where people get confused is death wands.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned before the reason why I called the guns death wands and not guns, but I don't tell you that. And I have a friend who comes with the podcast a lot. His name's Nate, and I had him read the book way early on. And it was a couple chapters in before he sent me a message randomly. He's like, wait a minute. These are just guns, aren't they? And he had that dawning moment. They're shooting muskets at one another. Okay. Which is exactly the moment I kind of wanted to happen when you realize that, the technology can feel magical when you aren't overlapping your frame of reference that you're familiar with. But yeah, the guns are literally just guns. Now, the things that make the guns are magic, the gremlins. But the things that make the gun, they don't have to be gremlins. It's just the people of this island don't know how to make firearms. They don't know the metallurgy. They don't know the manufacturing process. They've tried to copy it without success. It's kind of the same way, like, you know how the Greeks had slaves, so they didn't build a steam engine, but they kind of could have built a steam engine. It's the same exact thing. So because they're gremlin slaves and you could just get them to build the guns and then buy them, and it's like way easier than trying to reverse engineer it with a bunch of essentially useless unionists, because that's what you get when you have an entire guild system to determine who has what job in your city. So yeah.
So it sounds like path of least resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm getting here is that the actual magic in your world is more qualitative than quantitative. There's no system, but as long as all the parameters are met, then the magic will happen.
Yeah, I got it from reading The Lesser Key of Solomon, and what else? There's some other book I have. I have a bunch of old alchemical texts I need to get through as well. But yeah, and I noticed that when you look at references to people claiming to actually be able to do like occult magic in real life, it's not systematized at all. What it always is an evocation of the spirits. So there's something outside the self that you need to call forth to get on your side. Sometimes you need to bind it using a ritual to make it obey your will. But no matter what, it's a thing outside yourself that with, let's say, with the proper ritual performance, and really importantly, and I got this from studying a bit of alchemy, particularly through Yoon, through the transformation of one's own soul, one can bring about a change outside, right? That's kind of one of the interpretations of like as above, so below, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you need it. I transform the soul with the Philosopher's Stone in particular. The alchemists really actually did think this. You had to elevate the status of your soul, and that was part of essentially what allowed you to make the Philosopher's Stone outside of yourself, which will let you do the magic. Now, I like the symbolism of that and the like psychological significance. I don't think you can do that. You can't make the Philosopher's Stone, unfortunately. But yeah, for the magic, that's the inspiration I went with. Yeah.
It sounds a lot like and this is just a little trick I like to tell people, that the emotional follows the physiological, just like it does the opposite. Like a steering wheel affects your actual wheels. Like if you smile and you force yourself to smile, you will find yourself starting to feel happy because the two things are linked in your mind. So when you're happy, you smile, but if you force yourself to smile, you'll feel happy, even if you don't have a reason to. But we do have a question for you. So let me see. I had this in my mind a moment ago and lost it. So I'm just going to read the whole comment. Well, the whole talk about mixing magic and low tech made me interested. So here's my question. How do you write when taking some really weird concept and making it normal for people in the setting?
So how I would go about that, there are probably a couple of different ways. The way I would do it is going to be a turnoff for a bunch of people, so be aware of that. But the way that I do it is just have the people treat it as normal, and do not. What I don't do is exposit for the reader. Like, I hate spoon feeding. If this helps you, the kind of games I really like Dark Souls because it doesn't tell you anything. And I write, and you know, Alex, you may have experienced this a little bit, where sometimes they just don't tell you things.
Yep.
Like, it's kind of there cryptically in pieces, and I kind of make you put it together. To the point where if okay, and I got this from Lovecraft, by the way, with Turnpin's History, because it's in the Mysterious Case of Charles Dexter Ward, I believe. There's a point where you have to read these letters, and they're written like that. In fact, they're worse than what Turnpin's was. Turnpin's was nothing compared to the freaking letters in Ward, and it took me for freaking ever to be able to read them and understand what they're saying, because the spell, not because the words were that different, but the spelling was completely inconsistent from letter to letter, and not how we spelled things. But it was really freaking cool. I won't lie, it was a pain in the ass. But after it was a pain in the ass, I felt good about having figured it out, in the same way that, like, if I figured out something in the plot of Dark Souls. So what I would do to answer the question is you just have to show in scene the thing that's weird enough times that the reader can piece it together and just treat it as normal. The conventional way to handle this, like if you pick up any traditionally published fantasy book that has a weird element to it, is, and I hate this, by the way, but what they'll typically do is they'll double and triple explain. So what you'll see, and I kid you not, I saw this really badly in something like the Dresden Files. You'll see something described in scene. The characters will talk about it again in dialogue, and then the narrator will summarize in narrative exposition, and sometimes all on the same page, right? Like, so it's like making sure, do you understand this is how this is?
Spoon fitting it, basically.
Yes, and I will not lie to you. I think that if you want to appeal to most people who are particularly reading to escape, right? If they're just trying to turn their brain off and get into the story, part of what lets them do that is the repetition, right? Because when you're just getting hit with it over and over and over again, if your brain, you know how when you read, sometimes your brain just clicks off and like you can't remember the paragraph you just read.
Yep.
Well, people who read for pleasure, a lot of the time, they don't go back and reread the paragraph that happened in. They don't.
Yep.
They just accept it. And so that's I think that's why they'll do it 2 or 3 times, because what that means is if my brain clicks off and I skip 2 of the explanations, I still have 1. I don't have to stop and go back. I'm not confused. I just keep going that way. If you're an active reader, that'll drive you insane, which is why I hate it so much. But we're forced into this dialectic. It's who are you writing for, right? Like if you're writing something to appeal to someone who just wants to turn the brain off and escape, then you'll need to do what I just said, which is have it in scene, right? Which is the show don't tell rule. Show means it's in a scene. It's not being summarized by the narrator. Have characters talk about it, and or have the narrator describe it in summary. If you have all those 3 things within short order, no matter how weird the thing you're writing about, the reader will be able to understand that it's normal in the context of the story. Or you can just bombard them with the weirdness until they get it or they don't.
Well, we got another question for you. What do you think when some people say that magic in literature promotes pagan ideas and modern day magical rituals?
I would say it kind of does, but I have a really weird perspective on this. So like I'm the guy, it's the only way I could frame this. I'm the guy, if you sat me next to like Jordan Peterson, I would say to Jordan, I'm an atheist. He would go, no, you're not, bucko. And then I would say, I know what you think an atheist is and what a non-atheist is. And then if I'm using your definitions, Jordan, I guess you're right. But if that's confusing to normal people who don't think that way, and now everyone's confused. Good. So now that everyone is confused, I do actually think that the inclusion of magic does include pagan ideas, but I think that's inevitable a lot of the time because we get a bit union about it again. We are not really unified beings as human beings, right? You have different emotions and different drives, and they compete with each other. Like, this if you're like both hungry and tired, and you really don't want to get up and like go make yourself something to eat, but also you're hungry, and then you have this war in yourself about what are you going to do? Am I going to relax and sit here, or are we going to eat? And like, and you can have that with a number of feelings, right? Like you really want to write your next novel, and you have that ambition, but you also have the lethargy and the inertia of the amount of pain and suffering and research and time and discipline that you're going to have to put in onto yourself to be able to do it. And that is fundamentally where, like, I would call the pagan spirit comes from. And then the kind of magic is symbolic of a lot of those things, and a lot of those things in us and between us as people, as we interact with each other. Because when we interact with each other, we're not always the same people all the time. He's a hungry example. If you're hungry, like maybe you're a jerk, like maybe you have a short temper. Maybe you'll say things to hurt somebody, and then when you're not hungry, you're not that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't say that. You can't just dismiss it as saying someone is just hungry. By the way, if someone says just, merely, only, any of those words, those are a form of reductionism, and that, for everyone out there, is really useful for all of you for the rest of your life, not just talking about literature. The thing that comes from that is probably a lie. And the reason why is because you could say, like, okay, I'm just hungry. But you're not just hungry. You are hungry. And that has consequences and other factors that come into it. So being hungry means that you're in a particular physiological state that might actually reduce the ability of your frontal neocortex, which is a growth out of the motor cortex,
Mm-hmm.
which means it's already embedded in something that's closer to instinctive action than you would otherwise think it is now powered down. And maybe your amygdala is less inhibited than it otherwise would. There's all kind of like you mentioned before, there's a connection between the emotion and like the body. They're not disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, going back to the pagan thing, what people should understand is that, like, paganism is not, there is like paganism, like the set of beliefs that are not the monotheistic beliefs, right? Okay, like, yeah, of course. But the impulse behind those things are rooted in the fact that we are also animals. And the monotheistic push is like, that's our ego consciousness. That's the part of us that says, like, I am I. And like the thing that seems like me when I'm not paying attention, that my body is doing things all the time, whether I want it to or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, if you include magic in your stories, you are going to be playing necessarily with pagan ideas. I don't think, actually, though, that those pagan ideas are in contradiction to a lot of people's monotheism. The reason why I think this is because I'm friends with a lot of religious Christians, and then we can start talking about like concepts of God, and we get along. And
Mm-hmm.
it's funny. I feel like this is perhaps pretentious again, but I feel like Merlin, right? Because like Merlin is a pagan wizard who is an ally with like the Christian king. Like that's kind of what it feels like. So that's a really long and tangential answer to does including magic promote pagan ideas? The answer is yes, but it's not necessarily bad, even if you're a Christian. But that's like, or a Muslim. Well, I don't know if Muslims would agree or not. Maybe if you're Muslim, let me know. But I haven't had any conflicts from those pagan ideas being in my work, even with Christian readers or other religious readers. So take that for what it's worth.
Well, it reminds me of when people say, when you face adversity, you see what type of person you really are. And, when people being hungry or, a little too hungry and they get grouchy, that could be it. But you are who I think I've always believed you are who you are, whether you're hungry or whether you're not, whether you're facing adversity or whether you're not, because all your life is not going to be adversity and all your life is not going to be comfort. You are the amalgamation of your previous actions to lead you to who you are today, regardless of what circumstances those actions took or what they took place under, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, so we got another question here, and feel free to answer it because it looks like it might be optional. So this might be a bit personal, so feel free to answer it as you wish. Some say all writers have put a little bit of themselves into their work. The Q is how much of yourself you put in your books. The
Yeah.
question is, how much of yourself do you put in your
Yeah.
books?
Depending on what it is. So with Wand Smoke, there's definitely elements of myself in Conti. The Conti is not that much me. Like the most I get really with Conti and similarity is how I felt about myself during a long time of depression. Um, but other than that, I don't really have very much in common with him. Sometimes my characters have a lot. Like I have a self-insert character basically, Kashim, and he shows up in a few stories. I've managed. I'm trying to handle it as well as Lovecraft did with I think it was Randolph Carter, which is sufferable, or like Conan. Really, Conan's a better example. If you didn't know, Conan was a self-insert for Robert E. Howard. Conan was 100% a self-insert for Robert E. Howard, but he still managed to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, sometimes I'll do that. And the way I play around with that idea is I'll make a character who I can both aspire to be, but then also has my same flaws, so I can figure out how I might overcome them. So for those of you who find yourself writing like self-inserts, if you want to avoid the wish fulfillment power fantasy thing, you can do that by figuring out what your actual weaknesses are,
Mm-hmm.
still giving them to the characters, and see how the hell do they develop out of this. And then in real life, you just go do that. It's really useful, actually. It's a really good exercise. I recommend everyone do it. But I do have other elements of myself um, in a number of the characters, or really my life in the characters. Like I mentioned before, the inspiration for Broken, that was very personal. Some of the characters are like people that I know with a particular element of their personality, just exaggerated. So like Dom Hall is a guy who does look like Dom Hall is described. He eventually shaved it, but he used to this long chin strap beard, old guy. He's like an engineer, and he thinks like an engineer, and he's very socialist minded. But he also has like an armory of guns in his house,
Mm-hmm.
which is it kind of fits with how Dom Hall is. And I based Nostius partly on my friend Nate. Um, so like I take a lot of things from my real life and put it in there, but I typically I'll take a small piece. I think of like Frankenstein's monster. I'll take many, many small pieces and I'll scatter them like seeds, because when you do it that way, you're not just telling like an allegory of your own life. Because if you do that, you can only pull that off maybe one time, and then maybe you should just be writing a memoir. If
Mm-hmm.
you're going to do that, right?
So, you, like I, have probably read a number of indie books. What would you say is the best and worst self inserts that you've seen?
Oh, I'm like hesitant to say what the best and worst are. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. But I've seen self inserts that were bad. I'll say why particular self inserts have been bad. So the worst of them, they usually are projected sexual fantasies. I've seen this across a number of works. Um, and it's funny the people they come from sometimes. Like there's one series of books in particular um, that was written by someone who's apparently like a conservative Christian. It's like, okay, well, here's all your repressed sexuality just being like squeezed out into this thick black tar. Um, and that's the worst of it, I think, is that. And then the second to that, the power fantasy stuff is more boring than it is cringy, right?
Mm-hmm.
You start to read it and you kind of get the idea, like, okay, this is you. I can talk about this is moving away from indie stuff. I'll talk about the Dresden Files, because when I was doing jujitsu for a little bit, the jujitsu instructor really liked the Dresden Files, and he really wanted me to read them. And I was supposed to read like the first three, and then I was supposed to read the first four. I got through the first two, and I hated both of them. Um, but that's a good example for bad, let's say, self inserts. So like there's a moment when Dresden is confronted by this warden in the first book that he's supposed to be watching over him, and he thinks in his head like, when I get surprised, I just respond with rage, and I could just kill someone like by burning them in ash, and I'm just like holding back. But if I wanted to, this guy would be toast, and like that is the feeling. I know, well, cool, because I was like a loser back in high school, scrawny kid. I've been that resentful, weak nerd. Like I've been there, and that's what you think when you encounter somebody who you you wish you just have this revenge fantasy that you want to fulfill. That's what that is, right? And you think
Mhm.
you're justifying in your head, oh, if I was just let loose and like in reality, I could totally take this guy. It's like no, 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 no. Like this is what you wish you could happen. That you wish that the people who make you feel let's say insufficient could just be crisped to ash, but they can't. So that's the worst of it in terms of like self inserts. The best, and I've mentioned. I don't know that I've seen like best inserts for indie stuff. And again, I wouldn't want to say that someone's work is a self insert because it's already hard enough out here. Like we don't need to really be cattily stabbing each other in the back just so
It's
that we can
true.
get a few more, a few more clicks, a few more views. I understand why people do that, but it seems disingenuous. I don't like it. Um, but yeah, I would say the best pulling that off was it. I mean, the Conan stories pull it off really well. I mentioned those before, and the Dream Quest for Unknown Kadath uh, with Lovecraft, he did that really well. And the reason why with Lovecraft it works the best, I think, was because the character is not um, all powerful. He needs help. He's bumbling about. He's kind of learning. He has a genuine growth arc, and the realization. I don't think Lovecraft realized it in his own writing. Probably not, given he's remained an agoraphobe. But the end of that book is essentially Randolph realizes that the place that he was looking for is with inside himself. The Golden Sunset City was his own freaking hometown the whole time, instead of him trying to go somewhere else. Why is that relevant? Well, maybe Lovecraft could have realized like, no, Lovecraft, you don't have to feel like an agoraphobic loser. I'm sorry, your mom basically, what's the word we use for this? Starts with a C. Um, can't remember it, but protected you. Um, so like overprotected you so much, and your dad died of syphilis, and like went into a mad fit. That's tragic, dude. But just realize you're good enough, and you actually have what you want. You're like you're writing, and you're doing what you want to be doing. Maybe I
Mhm.
just tell myself that so I don't feel like an impoverished loser. I don't know, but yeah, that. But I think that really is the successful self insert because the lessons that he needed to learn were present there, and the
Mhm.
character went through an arc to actually learn them. It wasn't just, yeah, look how awesome I am. Like, this is great. Everyone loves me. Like, all the girls are throwing themselves at me, and I can just beat all the bad guys because you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Difference there. Yeah.
I have to ask just because one of my favorite series is, well, it's a memoir, so it's obviously a self insert, as I'm a big fan of the James Herriot books. If you're, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, he was a veterinarian at the turn of the 19th century. And so you get his perspective before World War One and after World War One as he's being a large animal vet. I think it's a really good series because it's got happy moments, sad moments, and it's very, very English. But we got another question for you. What are some of your favorite books and why?
Yeah. So in terms of novels, I always tell people Blood Meridian. Um, Partly the prose is amazing. The other reason is Judge Holden. Um, like Judge Holden is like everything that the devil could be, and there's something that fascinates me about his character. Like, like I'm
I'm going to let
simultaneous.
you. I'm going to let you keep talking. I have to be right back, so just keep talking to the crowd for me,
All right,
please.
yes, sir. Yeah, so Blood Meridian, Judge Holden. I'm obsessed with that book. If you haven't read it, pick it up. Cormac McCarthy. I really liked Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. Um, the Brothers Karamazov is also very good, but Crime and Punishment, I feel it's a little shorter, and that was a nice awakening. And you kind of get this with any Dostoevsky novel, but you get to see your own pretensions played out in front of you in a very genuine fashion, and then you get to see how they're wrong. And that I really appreciated that from him. I mentioned Lovecraft's work, Shadows over Innsmouth. I really, really liked Shadows over Innsmouth because I actually felt afraid. There's a moment, and I think everyone says this, there's a moment in Shadows over Innsmouth where the protagonist is in his hotel room and someone's breaking into the hotel room. And what I think Lovecraft did is it's funny to say this, he made me kind of bored enough with the setting that when we get there, you actually are starving for the excitement, and it works. So yeah, I definitely really like that one. A bunch of the Conan stories are great. Tower of the Elephant is excellent, particularly for its description of the streets of Zamora. I always point people at that as well. But Queen of the Black Coast, I liked quite a lot. The musings that they had about religion. Plus, I think Queen of the Black Coast, at the beginning of that story, you have Conan like in front of a judge, and there's this line that just is perfect where, the judge, lectured him about civil responsibilities and other things he didn't understand. And then so Conan just hacks him in the head with a sword. I love that that line. So yeah, the Conan stories, if you haven't checked those out. What else? Something that I haven't already mentioned. Let me take a look at my bookshelf.
I always did like. I wanted to get into the Conan stories. I think it's a very interesting premise, writing a story about basically a monstrous barbarian who wouldn't care about the books at all. But it's not. I've never really been able to just jump into them. Just
It's
when
it's
when I
hard.
was. So what's getting back to some of the questions I've got prepared for you here. What's this current book is fantasy. Um, what would be your favorite genre to write if you could only pick one genre?
Yeah, I think naturally I would lean into fantasy for all the reasons. I won't labor on it because I've already spoken way too much. But yeah, I like the symbolism that is accessible through fantasy, its relationships to dreams and mythology. So that's probably where I would stay if I had to only write one.
All right, then let me ask you a different question because there was a big Twitter argument involving this. As far as art goes, do you believe that art has to be entertaining to fulfill its purpose, or can art just be anything and still have a purpose?
I wouldn't say either of those, right? So no, it doesn't have to be entertaining. Um, but I also don't think anything could be art or that art could have any purpose, right? So that opens the question like, well, what is art? Well, art is an artifice, right? So art is a human imposition upon nature. And we know that because you can look at a forest, but you don't call a forest art, no matter how beautiful it is, or a landscape, or anything that's not made by people. Okay, so we know that if we use Aristotle's for criteria, right? So you've got like the mover, the form, the substance, and the telos. So the mover is man. Now, art obviously can have many different forms and be made of many different substances. That doesn't seem to be of the essence of art. Now we're left with telos and the purpose of art. I think that if I look across all the different things that we call art, what we're looking at in common there is that there is some relationship to what I'm going to call, this is going to get unfortunately wordy, but that is which is, right? And I'm going to reference Richard Wagner for this one. I haven't really read into Wagner too much, but I have read about him mostly through Nietzsche. And that's where we get this idea that music is the most pure form of art. Why would music be the most pure form of art? It's because it doesn't make reference to any it doesn't make direct reference anyway to any other form or substance. Like if you look at all the other forms of art, like a painting is of things, or at the very least of colors, right, or of shapes. There's some form or some substance that it is using as a medium. All of like literature or lyrical poetry you've got reference to concepts. Um, sculpture, obviously, you've got the physical form. But with music, it's something else that's odd. And what it's corresponding to, uh, like what it's essentially what the religious would call God, and I think what secular person would call like the thing in itself, or the objective reality, or if you're going to get like new age about it, like the transcendent reality. um, if you listen to a lot of Joe Rogan, talk to like Duncan Trussell, and they start talking about like the thing that's behind all this, um, that it's the same idea. So what is art? Art is when human beings take nature and they form it into uh, a representation of that thing that is actually beyond their perception in some way. It's like you're trying to take nature and mold it into something representative of some fundamental um, reality that we have experience of. And you know that because it creates a kind of what you would call a numinous effect on you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an overwhelming feeling of emotion. Oftentimes those feelings are not good, right? Like if you see something that's really moving and it brings you to tears, and you feel that, like, I don't know if everyone feels it this way, but I know that I feel like an actual physical pain, right? It reminds me of, like, when your first girlfriend breaks up with you in high school and you feel like that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, right. It's not that feeling, but it's somewhere deep down in there, like in your chest and in the back of your head or somewhere. People describe it in different places, but I think that's what we're doing with art. We are trying to essentially make something that's closer to something that's both real and human. Why real and human? Because we're human. We only experience the world as human beings, so we can't know like what anything is outside of that perspective. But from within that perspective, we can humanize something to bring it. Let's not bring it accord with. It's not exactly right, but to make it represent something more transcendent than the phenomena that we experience day to day to day, to get us to experience it closer to its or noumenal state, if you're familiar with the Kantian terms. And if you're not, I'm not going to bore you with them.
Well, I got another question here for you, and this one's actually a bit more topical. It's a controversial question. How do you feel about the use of AI in writing, like using it for silly name generation versus someone creating whole plot points or rewriting short sentences into whole chapters?
I don't feel super strongly. Like, I don't do it myself. I think it's probably bad for you. What I mean by bad for you is like bad for you, like how junk food is bad for you. I think if you get into the habit of this is something people don't realize. Like when you sit down and you write a book, you're not just writing the book, you're also practicing being a better author. So if the more that you have a tool that automates that process, you are not going to make yourself a better author. You might make yourself better with the tools. And, if someone's using the tools to generate silly names, that's not that different than when I go on behindthename.com and I just start sifting through names and like searching up name meanings. Like, is that really that different? Like, I'm not the originator of the names. I'm just looking through a library. And in this case, a computer is looking through a library for them, basically. So if that's like, I'm not going to judge that too much. If you're producing whole paragraphs out of plot points, if you're being honest about what you did, if you say like this was generated using, blah, 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 like whatever program you're using, like ChatGPT or whatever, if you want to do that, I mean, okay, I'm probably going to buy it because I'm just not really. One is I've got way too much classic literature that I need to read that I haven't gotten to read. And there are a bunch of other indies who I want to help support them and read their stuff because I want people to read my stuff. And I realize like we're helping each other or we're not. And I'd rather us help each other. And honestly, a lot of these guys are talented. And you only find that out when you engage with their stuff. And I want to help them as human beings. Because I care about the practice of the art. And I'm not going to go and doing a crusade against people who want to use AI in that way. in the same way that I'm not going to prevent someone from stuffing their mouth full of, like, I don't know, cookies and getting diabetes. So if that's what you want to do, man, like, you do you. But and I realize that that's going to threaten my and my fellow authors' prospects. But I don't feel too strongly about that either, because that's happened with every technological revolution that's ever existed. And I think we're kind of being Luddites about it sometimes when we get, I think it feels good to be self-righteous, and people like to feel good. And also, if you jump on the controversy, even if you don't feel very strongly, you can get a lot of attention. I think a lot of the AI stuff really has been that, which again is kind of disingenuous. I don't like that. I don't know. I got Confucianism bashed into me in my martial arts training, so I like sincerity and I don't like grandstanding, even if I don't like what the other people are doing.
Somebody is talking about your cocoa powder.
Yeah, cocoa powder is delicious, man. I don't know why people think it's so difficult, but maybe it's because I drink black coffee, and I like don't really eat sugar. So for me, bitter things don't bother me. But yes, I have. If you haven't seen it, go watch me eat. I have one where it's cocoa powder, and the other one is cacao powder. So it's like unrefined. That's harder than I found out than the cocoa, because it does not dissolve as readily, and it's puffier. And so the trick really, if it doesn't bother you taste wise, is that you don't want to breathe until it's wet, because like if you start breathing, you're in trouble. You know, like you're in big trouble. And if you watch me really carefully on the second video I made, I almost start to breathe too early,
Mm-hmm.
and you might be able to see this very slight distress on my face, thinking like, okay, don't cough and embarrass yourself. This is supposed to be easy. And then once it gets wet, it's pretty easy. Actually, it starts to taste really good once you start chewing it, because it's just like your mouth is covered in chocolate and it's delicious. But
Speaking of breathing, I ran into almost the exact opposite situation this last week. I had to be pepper sprayed for a certification and run an obstacle course. And when you get done, you have to stand in front of an eye wash. Well, the problem is holding open your eyes under that eye wash and breathing at the same time is very, very difficult. You, since your whole face is in pain, you feel like you're drowning. But you don't have much of a choice because your whole face is on fire.
yeah, Jesus. Well, at least it sounds like you're getting a cool certification. I've never been pepper sprayed, so maybe I need to get pepper sprayed.
I don't encourage it. If you can go your whole life and not be pepper sprayed, I would advise doing that. I cannot talk, John. I can't talk directly about what my new job is. Suffice to say, it's so I got an engineering degree, and I'm going back to school to get a supplemental degree. But for that, I need a job that will work with my schedule, and my new job will work with my schedule. So, and it will hopefully help me get some other stuff done. Though I'm going to attempt to do it like all jobs to the best of my ability. Anyway, so getting back into literature. So a lot of people in books make a big deal about good and evil. Now, in your recent book, most of your characters are rather complex. They have good moments, they have bad moments. What are your feelings about good and evil in books?
You know, it had its time and place, but I'm really with Nietzsche on this one. That um, you know, because I feel very strongly about theme, that we have gone, to steal the title, beyond good and evil. What does that mean? It means that the fundamental dichotomy is no longer like, that. I'm sure you've seen the image of like Jesus arm wrestling Satan. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's what comes to mind. And where Nietzsche moved it is more like being versus non-being, right? So you can think of it this way: like, you got the world in it, and like, well, what if the truth is that if you're going to have a world, the world has to have evil in it, which is
Mm-hmm.
sort of like, if we talk in the Christian context, it's like God could not make a garden without a snake in it. Like, there's no such thing as making a garden without a snake in it. And then what do you say to that, right? Because you can't just say good versus evil, because it's not good versus evil. You have to have evil to have good. If you study Taoism, they're very much in that way too. Like, these literally you don't have good unless you have evil to juxtapose it against conceptually.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we end up with that area of being versus non-being. And I think that's where we can answer a lot of really, well, I say answer, we can wrestle with a lot of difficult questions. So, in the setting, you have these fairies, and the fairies cannot peacefully coexist with human beings, because the nature of the fairies puts them in opposition, in the same way that you have like a predator-prey relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Like the fairies, a lot of them eat people for food. They
Mm.
use human beings as a means of reproducing a lot of the time. Um, like it's mentioned in the books, like the sylphs lead children off of cliffs. Well,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, like the children turn into sylphs and they fly away. Most of the time, they fall to their deaths. And then you might say, "Well, how are you killing all these children?" It's like, "Well, we can't make any more sylphs."
That
So,
ooh,
yeah, right. It's like saying, like, "Okay, well, you just want us to not have any kids." Like, imagine if someone came and said that to like a whole civilization of human beings. Like, they're like, "But the process of you having your children is killing us." It's like, well,
sorry.
yeah, right, yeah. And then you have to say, okay, if this is true, how is it that we can live so that we can affirm the existence despite the fact that there is an intractable evil in it, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how is it that we can accept the fact that reality itself is tragic? So I don't have a problem with good and evil being in books, and I think perhaps for kids, it's still worthwhile. And I shouldn't be so insulting to say that, because I'm sure for some people, like the struggle between good and evil is going to be the struggle that they encounter in their lives. But I find it to be um, insufficient once you've reached a certain amount of psychological development as an adult, because
Mm-hmm.
you start to confront things where, if you think it's just good versus evil, right? Remember, I said just is the beginning of a lie. If you think it's just good versus evil, all you're going to do is blind yourself to the evil that pairs itself with the actions that you believe are good, and you won't account for it. And because you're not accounting for it, it will run rampant, and it might even take you out. And in fact, you might be the perpetrator of it, and you're just blind to what you're doing. Um, because life is complicated. So I think that when I write literature, I want the morality also to be complicated, because I want to wrestle with something genuine rather than act as though I know the right answer, as if I could know that, which I don't think I can. I think I have to stumble around blindly like everybody else, which is why Conti is blind.
Well, since we're talking about writing, which do you find more fun to write, good or evil?
Um, the evil elements are always more fun, but I think that's just because it's fun to be nefarious, right? Like I like having characters that have qualities that we today find distasteful. Like for instance, I like having characters with like blatant and casual racism or sexism, because it's like people are sensitive about it, so I get to poke at them a little bit. Particularly like with Ugyer in particular, like I just like having him go on a bigoted rant and then saying a bunch of true things at the same time. Um, and it's fun for me in the same way that I like reading Lovecraft, because he was unapologetically like racist, and uh, it's funny too, because I know his history, and like he's like a terrible anti-Semite, except that he marries a Jew, and like he hates the Irish, except that he's good pen pals with Robert E. Howard, who was like 100% freaking Irish, right, yeah. So it's more fun to write evil characters because of that, because like people aren't 100% evil and they're not 100% wrong. And so when you get to play around with their flaws, fundamentally they're more interesting, they're more fascinating. I I think a character that is too good ends up being this kind of moralizing soapbox on which one
Mm-hmm.
can stand, right? And say, like, look, I'm the good guy. Here's my representative, and he's for good things, not for bad things. Did you know that we're for good things? uh, yeah, you've seen that attitude, I'm sure.
So, one thing I like to ask all the authors that I interview is would you like to live in the world you've created?
More and more, yes. I'm actually contemplating if I ever am able to just buying a house out in the like southern part of West Virginia, like away
Hmm.
from most other people, and just like I don't know, starting a family down there, and then if I can make all of my income still work for that, live cheaply because it's West Virginia. That's the one advantage. Um, yeah, so with the One Smoke universe, there's an element of being close to nature, closer than we are now,
Hmm.
um, that I think I would like. And obviously, there's dangers, but I also think that the dangers present give meaning to life day to day to day. Like I thought about moving to Alaska for that
Hmm.
reason. So like when I go to like get my mail, like I have to bring a gun with me because there might be like a freaking bear. Because then like how you think about it, man, like if day to day when you go out of your house you have to look out for what are essentially literally monsters, like you're living in the fantasy world that you escape to at that point, right? Like obviously you could die and there's anxiety with it, but if you get over the fear, like fear of death, I say this every single morning before I get like a cold shower, as if a man sets his heart right and lives as though his body were already dead, he will find freedom in the way. It's from the Hagakure, written by Tsunetomo Yamamoto. He was a samurai.
Hmm.
But the point is, like, once you get over the modern fear of death, because I think we moderns are like kind of pathetic pansies, and you accept like, okay, I'm going to die, but what does it mean to live in a life that means something moment to moment? And it's like being concerned about the bear as you go to get your mail, right? Or like some other predators, or like being prepared for nature or being more involved with nature. Like I really like to learn to hunt. I lament not having anyone in my family who hunted to learn from when I was growing up.
Hmm.
But to be like I'm reading Havel's Homesteader, man. Like, do you know how much envy I had actually of his situation after a while? Like even like fuck like oh sorry I didn't mean to curse. Even the running with the cougar, right? Like
Hmm.
to come back and to live and to have this like this rivalry and vengeance and like double predator attitude toward this other wild animal who knows you, right? Like I know you and you know me. We're gonna watch out for each other. We're gonna see who wins this game of life and death. Like that's cool, man. Like if I wrote a memoir, I would be able to put that in my memoir.
Oh, Hapless
But I don't know.
Homesteader. That was not a book I ever intended to write. I just got the idea listening to conspiracy theories. I'm like, oh, that's a cool idea for a jumping off point. It's like, well, if I take all these, because this was back during the beer bug, and everybody like you heard all the conspiracies, this and that and the other thing, and I thought, these are kind of crazy. What would happen if they're all true? And then my natural thought process kicks in. Is like, well, everybody would die. Okay, I can make that story. So it started writing itself. What do you do when everybody around you has died? And that became Bob's story. And I never intended to write it. I didn't think it was going to take off at all, but I ended up getting some people reading it. So I kept it up. I do have to finish the second book on that. It's like 3 chapters from the end. I know how I
Please
want it
do,
to
man.
end.
It's
It's
it's a great if you guys haven't read it, which I'm sure your audience has probably read it, but if you haven't, like I was surprised with how engaged and engrossed I got into the story. Like I think it's because I talked about that genuine attitude. Like I could tell, like you went in without chapter to chapter knowing how to solve the problem that he was faced with, and like actually went and figured it out. Because then he went and figured it out.
Yep.
uh, yeah,
The
that was a good experience.
the hardest part with it wasn't so much um, what his how to fix his problems, is how is he going to learn to fix his problems, because he doesn't have, like, I have access to the internet. I can find 1,000,001 solutions to all sorts of things, but what did he have on hand? Because the city he was living in was based on the city I was living in at the time. So I had to be like, okay, where can he go? Where could he learn the thing? Because I had just gotten out of college a few years before, and I'm like, well, the college isn't going to help, because I've seen those textbooks. You've seen those textbooks.
Yeah,
You know
yeah,
how
they're
little those are
awful.
going to help. But
Yeah, they're
well,
trash.
I'm really glad you enjoyed it. That was just kind of an experiment. I wanted to write a very small story with a very tight focus, and poor old Bob, he suffers so much. Not not as much as There's a third book kind of pseudo planned, but I'm not sure if I'm going to write it because I feel like I don't want to write him a story if it's not going to be interesting. I want his
Well,
stories to be interesting.
I would say if there's a problem, right? If there's like a set of circumstances and you approach it the same exact way that I've seen with the first book, I wouldn't worry about it not being interesting, because what makes it interesting, I think, is that sincere searching and presenting of new knowledge. Like if if you've got an idea about, okay, well, what would he run into next? He'd run into this. How would I solve that? Like, the moment that you're really not coming in with a pre-planned answer, I think that touches on. It's funny to say this, but that's, I think, what makes it art, right? I kind of stole this from Jordan Peterson, but yeah, when you are really wrestling with a question, you end up finding something that's true, and that truth gets represented in the art, and that's what makes it art itself and what makes it meaningful, and I think why I liked it so much. So
Well, the first book was about the immediacy after a disaster and finding yourself alone. The second book is the other survivors finding this survivor and how they conglomerate together. The second book is called Dam Problems because they're trying to fix a dam. The third book would be more about the old world coming to visit, or coming in contact with the new world, and that would be the remnants of the former government coming in to this area that has established itself after a few years. And now the government's like, okay, now we're here and we want to be in charge again. And that one actually has a name too, and that one's called Old Flags because I'm making fun of the 4chan name. So I just thought that would be funny. But I don't.
that's a good question.
Yeah, that's all the questions of the series. Like, because the second book answers the question, okay, now all these people are in contact. Not everybody was as successful as Bob. How are they going to work together? What's necessary to bring them together as a people? Okay, who survived and why did they survive? The third book is about, the big old establishment coming for the new establishment. But there's a term for it you hear if you listen to a political YouTube, where a rising power meets a dominant power. And that's what the third book would explore. But I'm not sure if that would be interesting enough to justify a book.
I think it is, and the reason why I think it is because we are currently seeing a in modern society, people wrestling with modernity and a desire to like go back to a more I don't want to say primitive time, but a more close to nature. Like everyone's saying, go out and touch grass. Like, why are people saying that, right? They're saying that because they're realizing, oh, okay, the old establishment, the old institutions that were all predicated on Enlightenment ideas that moved us away from nature so that we can bend nature to man's estate, or whatever the Francis Bacon quote is. I think it's Francis Bacon. But that led us to a place that we don't like. And now I think there really is a question between like, do we need to like move and separate from this? But this old institution, it imposes on you wherever you go. It's actually kind of hard to get away from it.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a deep, if you're not born away from it, then you're in it, and trying to figure out how to leave is tough. And I think, looking at how other people who are trying to maintain themselves against such a thing would speak to the heart of what a lot of people are feeling. At least maybe I'm projecting. It's just speaking to the heart of what I'm feeling. But if that's the case, I still want you to write it.
Well, I will certainly get in. I got a little burnt out on it because when I first wrote Hapless Homesteader, it was a weekly thing. Like every week was a new chapter. So I did that for almost 50 weeks, and I got a little bit burnt out while I was doing a rewrite on the first Battle Games book at the time, and I was finishing up the second Battle Games book, which I'm now going through and giving it I'm giving it my final edit before I throw it out to the last of the beta readers. I've got an appointment set up to have it edited, so that should be out in December. But that was an experiment just to, I want to see what I'm missing in writing, so I threw that out there. It's like somebody on the internet's mean enough to tell me everything that's wrong with the book. Part of life is learning to use the forgive the term, you learning to use the assholes to your advantage.
Yeah, well, what I found out is a lot of the time people aren't really assholes because they even want to be.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you realize that it's probably good for you to encounter people who are going to heckle you and give you a bad time. And oftentimes, what they want to see is that you got some spine, and so they can feel better about the world. I don't know how many times This is a funny little story, a bit of a tangent. When I taught at the university, when I caught someone cheating, um, a lot of the students at Wheeling University, in particular, when I was there, they had a bunch of like essentially inner city black kids who they gave scholarships, and so they definitely took the scholarships so they could go to university on whatever their athletics teams were. And so they had these terrible high schools in their like inner city area, and they also like most of them didn't have dads, right? So it's like my situation, right? Like
Yep, same here.
I'm kind of that kid, right? Yeah, yeah. So I'd catch one of them cheating, and I'd put on my samurai voice and like say I could call them out, and they'd start groveling. And I literally would say things like groveling is unseemly. And it's like the first time in their life they had some masculine figure tell them to like straighten their fucking act out.
Mm-hmm.
And you will not believe how positive they were in response to that. And I think a lot of the times when people are being jerks, it's a bit in the same way. You see this with kids too. If you have kids, if you don't have proper boundaries for them, they're like little sociopaths.
Mm-hmm.
But when you show them like here are the boundaries, they suddenly learn, oh wait a minute, other people have wants and needs, and I need to follow those. But if I do follow those, I can get what I want within reason, and everything is ordered, and I don't have to feel like I'm a wild animal, and they feel better, and they treat you better, and you treat them better. I think it's the same thing's true with assholes, basically.
And then
like, you obviously don't let them walk all over you,
Yeah.
but you don't react, and
I find men in general, and I include myself in this, feel better when they know their place in the hierarchy. When they've been established, it's not only feels like a moment of acceptance, but you know where you stand, you know what you can do and what you can't. And I think men really respond positively to that. But on a more social note, I think a lot more people would benefit from bringing the trades back to schools. Not everything has to be academic. And skills are great. Like I learned how to wire a house. I know how to like do plumbing. On top of every other, I think a lot of people really need to be taught these skills. But in this case, just asking on that, what do you think about such things like trades and bringing them back into schools?
Yes. So I'm like a useless academic, and I lament being such. And I would not wish more people into that. I think that one, everyone go read the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Everybody, if you have not read it, go read it. Then once you've read it, you'll start to understand. Like, wait a minute, all this like modern, highly educated BS is like you don't need that. What you need, all you really need, do you know how to get food for yourself? Do you know how to maintain something like your shelter? And then you start learning other skills to make like those things look a little bit better. And that's really what it means to be a human being. That's it. That's it. Can you get food? Can you get shelter? If you can do that, you can have a family, you can have kids, you raise the kids, you have a happy life, and you don't starve to death, and you live in maybe not the most comfortable conditions that you ever could with as many luxuries, but those things are not important. And honestly, also, once you're done reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, go read The Bell Curve. And what you'll realize when you go read The Bell Curve is that very few people have ever been cut out to be the white collar of society. And when we try to make everyone the white collars of society, we essentially just make this entire parasitic class. There's very few people who are competent enough to do that job and not essentially make what they're dealing with worse. If you don't believe me, go find a business with an HR department. Walk into yeah. Okay, so you understand right away. So before its financial exigency, Wheeling University, they had I walked in to get hired there, and there was like someone outside the door for the HR department. There was like someone kind of to greet you like immediately after the door, and then there's like someone behind another desk that was like a midway like person, and then the actual offices were after that, and there were like 10 people, and all they're doing is like answering emails
The
essentially.
bureaucracy
So
exists to feed the bureaucracy.
yes. And that what that does is that actually reduces the amount of available value, which drives up the price of everything. Right? Because like
Mhm.
if you have more people extracting money from, let's say, the institution, and you have a bunch of institutions doing this, then what you're having is people who are not contributing but who are getting paid, which means
Yep.
the price of things have to go up for whatever that service is being rendered and however they're getting the money. And so, like right away, like actually, we need trades because if you have trades, the trade is literally an ability to produce something of value. That's what
Mhm.
it is.
It's a skill.
So if you're, yeah, if you're doing it, chances are you're benefiting yourself, and that benefit to yourself is going to, at the very least, make you not a parasite to anybody, and then also you're probably going to be contributing, probably because you're going to have people who are dependent now on you because you're skilled at something. So yeah,
Mhm.
as much as I am uh, like a pretentious intellectual, like pseudo philosopher on the internet, I do not think that that should be the course of most people. And if I could help it, I would learn a bunch more. And I hope to actually be able to do so in the relatively near future before I'm 40. Learn some, well, really, yeah, like before, I've got a few years on me yet, but, or to go,
Well,
yeah, I should say.
a lot of people make career changes at 40, especially nowadays. But I'd like to add, just from what I've noticed and from what I've experienced, learning something practical, going and doing a practical job that's necessary, will help most people in writing. I think some of the best writers in history continued to have a day job of some kind. Pure physical labor. I think a lot of the you would might know better than me. I think a lot of the Greek philosophers and writers, they would be like members of gyms and things that would deliberately make their lives harder because it's through our suffering that we develop and grow. And
Yeah, yeah.
learning to have something tangible where you can build something, create something, make something gives you a whole new perspective on how things work. And any experience you can get is going to increase your abilities as a writer because you've experienced something new. You have a way something to reference when it comes to describing how something works or what you're looking at. Or at least that's been my experience.
No, I agree. My undergraduate degree is in exercise physiology, which a lot of schools will call exercise science. It's essentially useless by itself unless you want to be like a personal trainer, but then you got to get accredited accredited through some other organization. But I was going to go into physical therapy, but decided not to because I wanted to pursue my dreams, being an author, and here I am pursuing the dream, living the dream. But yeah, I worked a number of small like jobs that if I had not worked them, I don't think I would have the proper experience if I didn't have the martial arts training too. Because again, I was lucky. Because again, most you go to most places, they do this like tag fighting. It's really goofy,
Mhm.
and so we got some actual experience of, so objectively like what it feels like to get hit. What does it get? Does it feel like to get thrown onto a hard floor? What did you have, what if your opponent is bigger than you? Because we did not divide by weight class. So if the person is stronger than you, what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
Um, if they grab you, because like there was no division really between grappling and striking, and so it's like okay, well that matters. And then beyond the martial arts training, I worked for a long time at various just small service jobs mostly because that's what's available here. But even then, like I worked it's a bit of a stereotype. Worked for a while as a barista, but learning to make a product and actually to try to be decent at it,
Mm-hmm.
um, and deal with people and be on the bottom of a social hierarchy where you're serving people. I think that's really useful, right? To be the guy. I don't know how many people looked at me and thought, like, okay, here's another high school dropout, like working as a barista. Uh, I don't know how many times. This is another hit them with the hardback literary novel I'm going to write moment. It's
Hmm.
like I have more education than you. I am probably smarter than you, you old bastard, like who inherited some like BS properties that because we have a lot of slumlords, basically where people buy property, don't take care of them. I understand why this ends up happening, by the way, because the tenants are typically not good and you can't raise your prices up too high. That's a whole different thing about Wheeling, West Virginia. The point is, um, yeah, it's good to have those experiences so you know what it feels like to be that bitter guy behind the counter, to work a job you don't want to work, to actually have to get good at something, to deal with people you don't like, to see failure and understand what you have to do to overcome it in some real context, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true.
I sympathize with that. I'm about 6'2", and I've always been over 200 pounds. I'm a really bulky guy, so I go into. We recently had to do some hand to hand stuff, and I have to go with everybody because everybody wants to know what it's like to have to take on somebody bigger than themselves. And I'm like, I don't want to fight anybody. Come on, do we really have to do this again? But
At least you get to be the big guy, like beating down on him. I had to be like the little guy who had this freaking close distance with these gigantic orangutans. Oh my god, it's so
it,
annoying.
so we got another question. How do you feel about stories that use destiny for reason why something has to happen or has happened?
You can use it correctly, like becoming a literature professor for a moment. Like you can read Oedipus Rex, right? So or Oedipus the King. He is fated to kill his mother, and like I don't know if he's fated to have an incestuous relationship with his mother or not, but no, he's fated he's going to kill his father, and he brings that into being because he runs away. And
Hmm.
so you could say, okay, he's destined, he's fated for that to happen. But there's actually something of a question there. It's like, okay, if he didn't run away from his fate, would he have encountered it under better circumstances? Right? Because I think this might be a difference between fate and destiny. Because fate is like, I think it's an older concept than destiny. I think destiny is almost like this monotheistic predestination, whereas I think what fate is, it's like the cards that you were dealt. Like you were put under these particular circumstances, born in this time, and so the range of possibilities for you is necessarily limited, which is kind of true, right? Like you're not born at some other time to some other place. You have a particular body, you have particular proclivities. You'll have certain influences available to you, and others will not be available. Like it just that is how things are, and then you make choices within that framework. So what I would say for I would not rely on a hard destiny like this is predetermined, because I don't think real life works that way.
Hmm.
I think that though you can hearken to old ideas of fate where a thing will happen, but how that thing comes to happen depends on the choices made by the characters. And I think that does feel right. It feels real. It means that the characters' choices still matter. And it fits in with the idea that, like, yeah, there does seem to be a set of conditions that you are limited by. It's not just anything goes.
I've never been big fan of the idea of destiny myself. I feel like it's like giving a major spoiler to where the story is going to go. Like it's one of the reasons I checked out of the Wheel of Time series is because from the beginning I'm like, okay, I know how this is going to end, and it felt a bit predictable to me. Though I might be entirely wrong. I stopped half a book into I think a 12-book series, so it could have really surprised me. Um, Speaking of that, what aside from your own works, what's some of your favorite magic systems and other works?
Um, Mostly, if I could call it a magic system, I kind of don't like it. I'm trying to think of what's on my shelf. Yeah, I like the magic when I don't understand exactly how it works. So some of the old pulp stuff. I don't really like. This is one of the issues is I haven't seen it used in a lot of works because I haven't read things that I should have read. Like I haven't read The Hobbit. I have not read The Lord of the Rings or Tolkien. I have not read anything like any of Brandon Sanderson's work. I have not read Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. So there's a bunch of stuff that I probably should have read. But the things that I have read with magic systems, the example I like to give is Shad M. Brooks' Shadow of a Conqueror. And I know that he got a bunch of heat. Yeah, he got, well, look, the book, I'm not going to lie, the book is bad. But the reason the book is bad, I think people approached it the wrong way. It's all an execution problem, right? So let's talk about the magic system. He wanted to have this thing fleshed out like physics, and I think it's, and if you happen to be autistic, that's cool. I have no problem with autistic people, but I think Shad is autistic. And why do I think that? Because I think the way that he approached this is like a world of objects rather than a world inhabited by spirits that you have to try and kind of negotiate with, that you don't really have control over. And the more that you do that with your magic system, the thing is, it doesn't feel like magic anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it starts to feel like physics. But the problem with that is it's really hard to make physics that aren't real physics. So when Shad tried to use him as an example, the bonds of light, he could bind them to like certain attributes. But the problem with that is those attributes are philosophically like not one thing. Like speed is not a thing, right? Like
Yeah.
speed isn't a thing. Speed is a product of other physiological things happening that aren't always the same. And so it doesn't make any sense. So we're trying to make this scientific essentially, right? But we've immediately loaded on something that it doesn't map onto because it's using categories. So you can see this is why I don't like this. Also, I think hard magic, it's supposed to limit things, but I actually think it does the opposite. So I had a conversation with fellow indie author Brad, also known as Wraith or codename Wraith of King's Wrath. You can look them up on YouTube. They're a power metal group. They're looking for a singer. So if you're Canadian, I don't know exactly where in Canada they're at. Not Ontario? Maybe Ontario. I can't remember. Doesn't matter. They're looking for a singer. Check out King's Wrath. Brad, codename Wraith. Shout out to them. But I talked to him about magic, and we started talking about Star Wars. And early Star Wars, if you want to go like hard to soft with magic systems, early Star Wars is actually really soft. You don't really know what it can do because it is limited by symbolism, right? Like the ability to like the force choke is the ability to like cause someone to suffocate and stifle them without being exactly present, which is what a tyrant does. Like the tyrant can only squeeze. That's all they know. They can only crush and make sure that you have no room to move, no room to breathe. And they can do that without touching you because they act through the force of like an institution. And that's the force choke, right? But that's not described that way. It's just, it embodies its symbol. But as the powers start to get categorized and normalized, the weird things start to come in to try and like harden the system to explain kind of how it works. And when you do that, the former limitation, which was the symbolic, which is actually a lot tighter of a boundary, starts to open up. Because what happens when you introduce essentially a system of fake physics is all of the plot starts to go around, well, how can we exploit these fake physics? Because the characters would do that, right? Like they would, like we do in real life, we try to use physics to our advantage. If I'm fighting, how do I get leverage? What angles of attack can I use? How can I make combustion into a weapon? It's a gun, right? But like the moment we do that with the force powers, then all of a sudden, if we could jigger away in our heads to come up with a new power and a new power and a new power, and I can use this power in a new way. Or another, modern example is like Avatar: The Last Airbender was really cool. I actually really liked it. And then they made the spin-off sequel-ish thing, The Legend of Korra, and they took the lightning benders, and that was like this really profound thing where one had to be like at peace with yourself to even be able to do it. It was dangerous, and it was this high form, and there were only a couple characters who could do it. And then like now they're at the electric power plant, and they're like fueling their electric lines because they just have people shooting lightning into them.
Yeah, that
You see?
yeah, I have to say I wasn't a big fan of Korra, and they had the potential there for it to be something really cool, but I think they squandered it, and as it went on, it just became harder and harder for me to watch.
Yeah, repeatedly they squandered it, and I mean I could go on and on about that. I won't, but so that the listeners understand, part of the reason that happened was because they kind of leaned more into the hard aspects of the magic, because the magic is the bending, but the magic was kind of based on Chinese philosophy, medicine, and religion and mythology in the first one. So again, you had symbolic limits, and those worked.
I feel like they really ruined the spiritual side of things in the Korra side of it, because before it felt mysterious and dark and dangerous, and then they spent the time to explain it in the third season of Korra, and I feel like that ruined it.
Yeah,
which I have watched both series numerous times because I used to be nothing but a gamer who sat and watched shows while I play World of Warcraft. So I've watched a lot of stuff. But speaking of Shad's book, I think getting into the hard magic system, which I knew things were getting bad at about the 2/3 mark in the book, where he takes about a page and a half to start explaining the math behind the skyship that he is jerry-rigging. And that's when I started.
That long?
No, I knew it was bad when we got chapter 2 of power testing and chapter 4 of power testing. And
yeah, the power testing went on forever.
He could have probably trimmed about 60% of the exposition, 60% of that book, because about 60% of it was just straight exposition. But
yeah,
and the thing is, I like Shad's channel. I listen to Shad in a bunch of places. Like his channel itself is pretty good. I used it a lot for when I was writing battle games. Like just learning about weapons and how armor works, and you're getting into that kind of autistic detail that he does. But
yeah,
if he hired a developmental editor, I think he told them no. I want this. I need this. Blah blah blah. He might have been a little too sensitive about cutting some stuff out. So we got one more question here. It says, what music do you like? Specifically, in order to better understand you, what are your top 10 or so albums?
All right. So the answer quickly, since you got to go. Windmills, and then the Loyalist. And there's an MC who is in both of those groups. He's one of a couple MCs in the Loyalist, but he is the MC of Windmills in his framework. So you just go through all of their albums. For Windmills, As Above, So Below, Broken Records, and Stay Golden, and they have a smaller like mini album out as well. They do a Celsius 7, the name of which eludes me right now, but you'll be able to find it. And the Loyalist albums, I think one might be called just The Loyalist, and I can't remember the other two off the top of my head, but you'll be able to find them. So they had a huge influence on me in my prose. Essentially, it's two different rap groups, but they're kind of part of what you call like the positive tip. So general positive messaging, though also 36 Chambers of Death by Wu-Tang Clan. Let's throw that on there as well. Moving away from rap, Florence and the Machine, particularly her album Ceremonials. She has a lot of pop in music, but whenever she had the liberty to make something that I think she actually wanted to make, some of her songs are actually pretty decent. Moving beyond that, I guess is a bit like hip hop beats, but anything by Nujabes, the DJ. He's only got a few things out because he tragically died in a car accident. But particularly like listening to his beats when I'm writing. That influences me a lot. Who else? That's all I can do. That's I don't know if that's 10 albums altogether, but yeah. So Windmills, Loyalist, Nujabes, Florence and the Machine, And I'm sure there's others that I'm forgetting that I've also listened to. A bunch of weird things you might not have thought of, like Regina Spektor. I liked Regina Spektor a lot. Just don't listen to her in an interview. Unfortunately, it's like that with lots of artists and musicians, though.
All right. Well, the last question I've got for you, and I like to ask this of all the authors I interview. Now that you're published, what would you say is the hardest part of writing?
The hardest part of writing, I think, is it's not necessarily the big revisions. It is the small combing over. So after writing my book and then getting it out there, like I don't have a problem writing first drafts. Really, I'm a slow writer in general, but it's not like I don't like suffer writer's block, and it's not like terrible, especially now. When I do large scale revisions, it feels kind of like writing again, so it's not too bad. But once you're getting really close to a final product, or you release something and you want to like do another edition or update the files that you have if you're doing print on demand, finding errors, especially after you have paid out like $1,000 for someone to make sure that there were not, and still there are a number of them. That's awful. And it's awful in a way that, like, when I'm looking for them, I have this terrible anxiety. So I've been putting out my book on audio for free over on my YouTube channel and on my podcast, which you can find on my website, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to listen to it there. But as I'm doing this, I'm synthesizing the voice with 11 Labs. So it's Dagoth from Morrowind, if you ever played Morrowind, which I loved as a kid.
Morrowind.
Yeah, it probably influenced a lot of my fiction too, to be honest. But as I'm going through and doing them section by section, that whole time, it's like it takes a couple hours to get through a chapter because they're kind of long. My chapters, again, they're like story length. The whole time, I just have this ambient anxiety, and after I finish, I just feel exhausted. And all I've been doing is just listening to my own book. So, final proofing it's a weird answer, I know. But the worst thing is the final proofing, because I want it to be good and done, and I feel this terrible shame, even though I've read other indie books and even trad published books, and everyone has typos.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know why I feel this way, but I hate it, and that's the hardest part about writing now for me.
And what would you tell new authors who haven't published yet?
Okay, so if you haven't published yet, I would say don't be afraid of publishing. Take the time to learn all the annoying things. I don't know how things are now. Don't be afraid of self-publishing either. I actually think that trad publishing is kind of corrupt at this point. And go try to find an agent, and you'll see why for yourself. You'll understand when literally half of them are like, I'm only taking like either LGBT things or like, don't apply if you're white. Yep. It's like, then I have to send them an email. Do I count as white? I don't want to be represented by you anyway. Yeah, I don't know how that conversation goes. It's always funny for me. But yeah, don't be afraid. And I would say finish works, right? I would recommend people write more stuff and get it out there and get it over with, and don't get stuck in the phase of thinking you need to do something grand and big to begin with or perfect. It's better that you practice going through all these motions, because each time you'll get a little bit better. You'll understand how to market each thing a little bit more. You'll understand how to format better each time. But if you just sit on a mountain of work and then you might get intimidated and never learn the process. But also between projects, you learn a lot. But if you save all your projects on the back end, there's a bunch of stuff that you don't realize is part of the publication process that you should experience and learn, right? I'm glad I learned it with a book that no one really read, that no one cares about, so I could have made all my errors early. And even now I'm still fixing them. I've had to change my book cover multiple times, and now I'm switching artists and I have to change it again. if you're going to commission art or pay for art or like buy pre-made covers, just spend more money and do it one time. Because I spent more than $1,000 now just on redoing a cover. So like, don't do that.
Well, where can people find your work, and where can they follow you at?
All right. So I like to send people to my website, wildilelit.com. You can follow up with everything I'm doing there. I'm also on YouTube, search up Wild Isle Literature. On a bunch of social media. So what am I on here? Twitter, Minds, Facebook, Instagram. If you're old and you use LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn as well. I don't know if anyone actually is on LinkedIn, but it's all MarQuese D. Liddle, just how I have it presented here on the bottom of the screen. So at MarQuese D. Liddle, and you can keep up with me there. Am I anywhere else? I guess if you want to buy my book, you can find it on my links on my website. That'd be the easiest way. Or you can go straight to Amazon and look up Wand Smoke Broken, and there's a colon. So Wand Smoke Broken, and buy it today.
And I do have that link down in the description, as well as your Twitter. I'll get your website once we get off the air here. And I am T. Alex Ratcliffe. You guys can just call me Alex. You can find my works on Amazon, also linked in the description at the bottom. And you can find me here on YouTube, Twitter, and on Rumble. And to everybody out there, I wish you all good luck.